Greetings! I'm Aaron Balave, and this is Michuan Guandao Secretly Transmitted Methods of the Guandao. This is my series for talking all things Guandao. In this video, I'm going to be talking about how the Guandao changed from the Ming to the Qing, focusing mainly on blade shape, and kind of referencing mostly antique weapons. So I previously made a video that talks kind of more broadly about how Guandao changed over time, and that video drew pretty heavily upon textual sources. Since making that video, I've kind of found more information on antique blades, so kind of a new reference point. Now, when we're talking about antique weapons with Guandao, it's kind of, it's tricky because there aren't that many surviving examples, and the ones that we have, they often aren't complete. So like, for instance, they usually don't have the haft still intact. Some of them do, but not very many. But obviously these were, kind of real weapons that were used or in one way or another in a pre-modern period. So they certainly give us good information. So we're focusing on the Ming and Qing in this period. So the Ming and Qing are the last two imperial dynasties of China. The Ming is from 1368 to 1644, and the Qing is from 1644 to 1911. Guandao have been around since at least the Song, so that's 960 to 1279. But antique weapons are from that period, or from like the periods in between, are exceedingly rare, and I don't really have any information on antique Guandao from that period, so I can't comment. A lot of the information I found in regards to antique Guandao come from this lovely book, Daobing xiangjian by Peng Peng. Highly recommend this book. Lots of great pictures, and not just of Guandao, kind of all sorts of different arms and armaments from the Ming, Qing, and Republican periods. So I highly recommend you check that out. I'll put a link in the down below. Unfortunately, I don't have permission to use the images from this book, and I don't know that many public domain images of Guandao, of actual antique Guandao. So I can't really show them to you in this video. So I'm going to do the next best thing, and I'm going to use Play-Doh. So let's get into it. Okay, so with our Ming Guandao, again, we have the same kind of basic features that all Guandao have. So we start off with our kind of crescent-shaped blade. Let me fix these chips in the edge there. So we've got a crescent-shaped blade, and with Ming blades, usually the curve of the blade usually starts somewhere around half of the blade, to the midway point right about here. And also at the midway point is where we get the hook at the back end of the blade. And with Ming blades, sometimes it's a little bit lower, but it's usually either at the halfway point or a little lower. It's not up high like that. And then of course, this space between the hook at the back and the tip, it can be a lot of different things here. Sometimes it's just like a bit of a curve or fairly straight, and then sometimes you get these little ridges. Put some little ridges in there. But kind of one of the key characteristics, so the Ming Guandao are fairly thin, but then the key characteristic here is that there's a medial ridge down the middle. So the thickest part of the blade is actually in the middle on both sides. And so it gives you kind of a diamond-shaped cross-section. And it can get quite thick. It's kind of, the Ming blades will sort of approach 1 centimeter in thickness. They're usually like 0.8 or 0.9 in the thickest part of the blade right here. And sometimes it isn't a ridge, sometimes it's flat. So it's kind of, instead of a diamond cross section, you get kind of more of a almond shaped cross section. But the important thing is that the center is the thickest part of the blade, not the spine. Center is the thickest part. So that's kind of your basic Ming Guandao blade shape. Let's move on to kind of, there's this particular kind of blade shape, and they don't talk about this in the book Daobing xiangjian, but he does have pictures of the weapon that kind of look like this in the book, and I've seen pictures of antique ones elsewhere, so I feel pretty confident in kind of giving a general shape for this kind of specialized late Ming, early Qing Guandao blade shape. So this one shares a lot in common with the Ming Guandao shape. So we have We have our curve, but with these late Ming, early Qing Guandao blades, it's pretty straight. It's very straight all the way up until the very end, and then there's a sharp curve. And again, this back part, we might get some little dips where it might be kind of straight. And then again, there is a hook about halfway or lower. And this one, it does not have a medial ridge, but it is thicker in the center of the blade, just like the Ming counterpart. So we still have a very thick blade, but in this kind of late Ming, early Qing model, it's very straight and then curves at the end. So now let's look at the late Qing Guandao blades. This is where things really start to change. So we'll get our crescent shape going. Ooh, this blade is a little dry. It's not really behaving the way it should. Okay, so with the late Qing ones, or guys, let's say mid to late Qing Guandao. So we have a lot of curve in these blades. And the curve starts, so it's still, I find these blades to still be straighter than the Ming ones. Or I guess that they have the same amount of curve, but it starts later. So in the Ming, whereas the curve starts about halfway up, in these mid to late Qing blades, the curve starts probably about a quarter of the way to the end, or from a third to a quarter towards the tip. That's when it starts to curve. So it's pretty straight for most of the blade, and then there's this kind of very sudden curve for the last third or quarter of the length. Now the hook on these late Qing blades is actually, it might be in the same place. It might be about halfway up, but sometimes it's also a little bit higher. And so this is a pretty important point, because so in the book Daobing xiangjian, the author also notes that these later Qing blades, the hooks don't show any sign of damage, but with the earlier blades they do. So it appears as though the hook in the earlier blades really served some kind of function, whereas in these later blades it appears to be more decorative and not as functional. So that's kind of one important distinction in these later blades. Another important distinction in these later blades is that they are wide and they are flat. So, whereas the Ming blade has this medial ridge, and this late Qing or late Ming, early Qing one has a kind of an almondy cross section, but is still very thick in the center. These blades are pretty flat all the way across. So whereas these ones are, almost a centimeter at the thickest part, this one is more like half a centimeter or maybe a little bit more throughout most of the width of the blade. So to kind of summarize here, so these earlier blades, the hook is in the middle or lower, and then the later blades, the hook is middle or higher. And the curve in these earliest blades, in the Ming blades, starts at around halfway up the blade, and then in this kind of middle period, the curve doesn't start until the very end, whereas in the late Qing blades, the curve starts kind of the last third or quarter of the blade. So now, why are these different? Why the change from here to here? Well, so in the book, Daobing xiangjian, the author suggests that these earlier blades were more for thrusting and for chopping. And this later blade is more for cutting and for slicing. And so his reasoning for believing this is that the earlier blades were going up against heavier armors, metal armors, so they had to, rely on chopping and percussive force to kind of, beat their opponent, or, maybe to thrust into the gaps in the armor. Whereas in this later period, in the mid to late Qing, firearms are kind of becoming a much more important presence on the battlefield.
So soldiers' armor is also becoming lighter, and they're switching out their metal armors for like cloth armors. So there's not so much of a need for this kind of heavy artillery of, not for these big can openers over here. You just need something to slice through the cloth armor, and a blade that is kind of thin and wide is pretty effective for doing that. So that's his explanation for kind of why the weapon changed over time. Now, I will say before going too far that these are just kind of generalizations in the shapes of the blade. They don't all follow this pattern. And in particular, I'll say that there is one kind of blade shape I've noticed that you see throughout all of these periods, and that is that the Guandao, instead of having the curve start halfway, be straight and then start halfway up, or be straight and then start for the last like third or fourth of the blade, the curve actually starts at the base, and then it curves outwards until about halfway up the blade, and then it starts to curve out. And we see this kind of an edge shape, this kind of an edge geometry in all periods from what I've seen of antique weapons. It's not as common as other types, but it's still there. And it seems even particularly more common in illustrations. So maybe there's something about that kind of is appealing to artists, and that's why it pops up pretty frequently.
So just another point I want to bring up is that in this book, Daobing xiangjian, the author also suggests that in the Qing, there were sort of two kinds of Guandao. There were the infantry and the cavalry Guandao. So the infantry Guandao is just kind of everything I've been talking about so far. It has a long haft with a butt spike, and then the crescent blade and everything. And so the cavalry version is pretty much the same thing. It just has a shorter haft without a butt spike on the end. And so the logic behind this idea is that when you're on horseback, if you've got a long weapon with a spike at the end, it's hard to maneuver, and you're going to end up hitting your horse in the head, or you're going to have a lot of trouble wielding it effectively. Whereas a weapon with a shorter haft and without a butt spike is going to be much easier to maneuver. And that makes a lot of sense. But the author's primary evidence for this in the book, from what I can tell, is this kind of very famous painting that we see a lot. It comes up a lot when we're talking about Guandao as a cavalry weapon. I can't remember the name of the painting off the top of my head. I'll put it somewhere here or somewhere. But so this painting shows these soldiers in pretty fancy armor, and they're holding weapons just as the author is describing. So these are short, they look like Guandao, but they have a relatively short shaft without a butt spike on the end. And so this is good evidence to make this case, but for me, I'd like to see other examples to know if it was really a thing. It could become more of an outlier rather than like a widely practiced rule in the Qing. Who knows? So that's all I have for today. I hope you found this interesting. I always appreciate a like and a subscribe, and let me know what you're thinking in the comments. And other than that, until next time on Meishu Guandao Fa, secretly transmitted methods of the Guandao.